Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Hi, I'm Pawan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. As the India-China conflict is heating up near Ladakh, it's important to take a few steps back and get some better perspective on what the India-China border is like, what our history has been like, and really get to understand these places that are so far from our workplaces and our homes in places like Bangalore or Chennai or Delhi or elsewhere. So to help us get a better perspective, today we have Mr. Joseph Thomas who's joining us. Mr. Thomas is an aeronautical engineer and a retired Indian Air Force test pilot. During his career, he was in the Aerial Survey Squadron and also was a wing commander. Joseph, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thank you.
So, Joseph, before you were in the Aerial Survey Squadron, you were also flying transport logistics during the 1962 war with China. Could you tell us a little bit about what your life was like back then?
Yes, it was my first posting. I went to Srinagar, and within a fortnight, we had the Galwan incident where some Gurkha troops in a camp were surrounded by Chinese troops. And there was a face-off. And finally, it was diffused. And that happened near the source of the Galwan River in Aksai Chin. And later on, during the 62 war, the Chinese did advance westward. And the present action in Galwan is, I would say, maybe good 50 kilometers to the west of where they were in 1962. And the Galwan incident of July 1962 was one of the triggers for the 62 war.
So while the bigger war was happening, being in the transport quadrant, what was your life like? Where were you flying from? Where were you flying to? Could you tell us something that is now declassified and in the public domain?
No, we were based in Srinagar and we were doing the airlift into Ladakh. So that time the only road to Ladakh was, or still is, the road through Zojila. So in summer, that road was open.
So this is via Kargil and...
Yeah, so you start from Srinagar and you go up the Sindh, the river valley, come to Sonamar, and then you come to the Zojila Pass, and then you go to Dras, and then you go to Kargil, and then you proceed further. You cross the Fotola and all that and enter the Indus Valley and go to Leh. So that is the ancient route which was developed into a road in 1947-48. And an airfield was developed in 1948 and we had a first landing in May 1948. But in winter, Zojila gets 60 feet of snow and Zojila Pass is closed. And so airlift was the only means of supplying men, material into Ladakh or out of Ladakh.
Could I ask what planes you were flying back then?
I was flying the Dakota. The other planes that were taking part in the airlift were the Packet C-119G, one squadron of IL-14s, then one squadron of AN-12s which are based in Chandigarh, and we had a few Mi-4 helicopters based in Leh.
And today, what might some of those same craft be? We've heard of this C-130J Hercules and...
Yeah, you got the C-130 Hercules. You got Boeing 737 passenger flights to Leh. Right. Leh is now as good as an international airport. Incidentally, the people of Leh saw aeroplanes before they saw a car. Okay, so life there is quite different. But especially in winter, we were the only contact between Ladakh and outside of Leh. Now, towards Leh, which was the major hub then and now, we had AN-12s coming from Chandigarh, we had Packets, we had Dakotas, we had IL-14. You know, it is a busy airfield even in 62. But Kargil and Thois, we were the only people flying. So when every time we flew there, they were very happy to deal with us and we were also very happy to deal with them. And the best tea I've had in my life has been the tea given by the army in Kargil. And incidentally, Kargil at that time was dominated by a hill. On top of that, the Pakistanis were there. But we captured that in 65, returned it to them. Then we captured it again in 71, but in 71 we did not return it.
After the war, your role also changed from being in the transport division to doing aerial survey. So could you tell us about that? How you got into it, what aerial survey was like?
We had a few squadrons of Canberra bombers, and the pilots were taken both from transport as well as from fighters. In the old days, we had the 4-engined Liberator, and that was more or less equated with transport because multi-engine flying. But when we got the Canberra, it was a highly maneuverable aircraft which had performance equal to the fighters of the day. It was a really advanced aircraft, and it is one of the few aircraft which the Americans bought from the British and license manufactured it. So it was so good, so much ahead of its time.
So could you give us a sense, these Canberras as transport planes, how many people could they transport or how much?
No, the Canberra's bomber, just one pilot and one navigator, and did a lot of bombing in 65 war and also in the 71 war. Then we had a small force in that which had the photo version of the Canberra. We had a number of cameras and extra fuel, which allowed us to go more distances. For instance, from Agra, you could fly to Trivandrum and fly back without refueling.
So that's a range of what, 4,000 kilometers or something without refueling?
Yes. So when we were operating Canberras in Bangalore, the Indian Airlines 737 also used to land there. And the Indian Oil people were surprised that we used to consume more fuel than the 737. So it is that extent, 64 feet span, highly maneuverable aircraft, and it could outfly the fighters of its day. Later on, of course, more advanced fighters came. So I volunteered for Canberras and I did the training. And after a year in a bomber squadron, I was put in the photo squadron.
So in your time, the Air Force itself was innovation and an invention. Once flights and planes became more and more powerful, and then people realized they could put guns on them, they could put other things on them. Before that, when we wanted to map the world, we didn't have the advantage of going 18,000 feet or 12,000 feet up in the air and looking at the ground around us. And in India, even in Bangalore and in Chennai, we have now a 190-year history, I think, of modern mapping. So could you take us back and give us a glimpse of that era of how the world was mapped before air forces and air reconnaissance and that time?
In the old days, very old days, maps were based on traveler's sketches. So that is there, and people drew sketches and all that. And it's very interesting to see some of the old maps. I might as well give an anecdote. Alexander's guru, I think, was Aristotle or Socrates. So he told him that India is a small peninsula just beyond the Indus River. And Alexander had ideas of conquering the whole world. So he did come up to the Indus. He went a little beyond the Indus. And then he realized that India extends for thousands of kilometers beyond that. So our knowledge grew as people traveled across. And also, when the sailing ships went from place to place, they drew sketches and maps and things like that. And for sailing and navigation, you required to take shots of the sun and moon, and you need to know your latitude and longitude. So it advanced into more precise mapping. So it is a evolution. As you go along, maps kept on increasing. Now, if you look at the 19th century, when the Survey of India was established, at that time, the technology was to use measuring chain and have a baseline between two places, 2 points. So measure that. And then with theodolites, let's say you have a small mountain peak over there. You take the angle from one place, angle from the other place, and by trigonometry, you found out the distance of that. And similarly, the theodolite would get the elevation, and now you know the distance, and from trigonometry, you get the height also. Now, this had to be done for each spot, for each hill, each ridge, each bend of a river. So it was really building up the map from bits and pieces. I'll give an example. You have today's digital pictures. They are on pixels, so many million pixels. So really the surveyors had to find the location of each pixel and put it into the map. It was a very laborious job. It took years and years.
And that's why it was called the Great Trigonometric Survey.
Yeah, the Great Trigonometric Survey Well, there are two histories of it. One history says it started in Bangalore. The other history says it started in St. Thomas Mount, Chennai, whatever it is. But from there, they covered the whole of India, which is a great achievement. And similarly, you know how Mount Everest was developed. And they also amalgamated travelers' sketches and stories, because the trigonometry doesn't give you the name of a place. So you needed travelers, people to go on the ground and get names of places, names of rivers, names of lakes, and put that all together. So it is a very laborious process, but it was done. And the Survey of India is a great institution, which is now 100 and maybe 70, more than that. I think one of these days they'll celebrate their bicentenary. It did excellent work in the 19th century and so on. But the problem is that when there's a high mountain range like the Himalayas, you have to go there on foot. And then there is also the cross-checking. You know, you do the survey and you proceed, let's say, in a south to north direction. Then you do the survey, let's say, from west to east, and put the two together. And wherever there are discrepancies in this, it had to be corrected. So it was a very laborious job. It's done like that. And the history of aerial survey, you may be surprised, will go back more than 200 years, because the first time that man flew was in 1783. Because in 1783, they flew in balloons. And when you go up in a balloon, it makes a difference, because you're getting the view as from a hilltop. So balloons in the 19th century were used for reconnaissance in wartime, but it enabled you to see the ground, and then you drew a sketch and came down, and that really upgraded the maps. So it goes back is more than 200 years. So from balloons, we progressed to powered aeroplanes, and powered aeroplanes now are almost 120 years. The initial cameras used in aeroplanes were handheld cameras. So you had the pilot, and you had an observer at the back, because cameras were big and bulky, and he took photographs. And those photographs were useful because it gives you correct picture of the ground. Then we progressed to cameras which are mounted in the belly of the aeroplane, controlled from the camera operator, and you took pictures. Now, there's a very important point about survey, is that survey depends on stereo views. So you have to take overlapping pictures. Fore and aft, you need at least 50% overlap. So you try for 60% overlap, so that every point is photographed twice. And then when you're seen from two different points, then the stereography enables you to get the height.
Because there is no GPS, there is no nothing else.
They were not even dreamt about, leave alone talked about.
For us now, GPS is so obvious. It's there in our phones, but it didn't exist.
Yeah, but when the first GPS came, I didn't believe that such technology could be made. So you had to photograph a strip fore and aft with 60% overlap. And also you needed these parallel strips to overlap by at least 10-15% laterally, so that you had the continuity. So aerial survey was a very precise job, had to be done, because you had to fly a precise height, and these photographs had to be done. And then there were timers fitted in the camera and all that, so that depending on your speed, these things were done. So the aerial photographs could then be used with stereoscopic viewing to get the heights and the contours and all that. And by the time I got involved in this, is now about 50-55 years back, the Survey of India had analog machines which could do this stereoscopy. It was not automatic. The operator had to make 2 points of light coincide, and then you got the stereoscopy. But it certainly speeded up the work and made it more accurate.
So in that sense, you worked in the Air Force, but you worked with the Survey of India. Is that how that some of that relationship was?
Yeah, it was not me as an individual working with Survey of India. It was the Survey of India working with Air Force. So we would have a conference, we'd meet them. I visited them in Dehradun, and they would come, or like say when we went to Northeast, the Survey of India office was at Shillong. So we had contact with them, dialogue with them and what they wanted and what we would do. But we not only did survey for Survey of India, we also did forest survey. We did survey for some of the dams. Bakra Dam was getting silted up. We did that. So for various purposes, you could do survey. Now, if Government of India wanted to make a new port at Paradeep, so we would survey the area, but then you have to survey it in greater detail. you fly at a lower height, you get more detail. And so we were really the agency, not just for the Air Force, Army and Navy, but also to a large extent for Survey of India, also for any other agency that wanted it. Like I've done the mapping for Bangalore. City survey was one of the things we did because it was done in great detail. Bangalore, Chennai, Delhi, all these places we've done city surveys. Of course, today there are satellites which didn't exist in those days. So it was a job where you learnt as you went along. To that extent, it was a specialized job. So in a period of 3-4 years, we had covered the whole of India, including Andaman, Nicobar, Lakshadweep, this, that. So in my younger days, I knew a lot of small places, villages over there.
This is overall about mapping. A Survey of India will make these various topographical sheets that will be used for various places. We have watersheds around Bangalore and elsewhere as well. But now I want to come back to India and China. And the moment we get into talking about mapping the border areas and surveying the border areas by flight and by other means, could you tell us about what you were involved in and what the challenges were there? Because it's very different, right? Flying over the peaks of the Himalayas and flying over Bangalore.
Yeah, we have done all the borders of India, Indo-Pakistan border, Indo-Nepal border, Indo-Bhutan border, Indo-Bangladesh border, then India-Burma border, and of course, the most interesting or controversial is the Indo-China border because that is the longest border and it goes from Kashmir all the way to Arunachal Pradesh, and there's a lot of history behind it and a lot of controversy.
Can I ask you to break that down a little more? Because one is that we do the survey, we understand the lay of the land, and those photographs, images, and also whatever ground investigation gets converted to a map on the paper, right? So Survey of India might do this map with a lot of lines, point. The other side might also do the same thing, right? So when does this map become something that people agree on? What is that process?
Yeah, I think the Radcliffe line between India and Pakistan is a good example to explain the process. So at a very high political level, it was decided to partition India and Pakistan. And the general principle was that the majority Muslim areas would form Pakistan. The non-Muslim areas, that is the Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist and all that, would go to India. So that was the general principle. But there was also the principle of contiguity. That for instance, suppose there was a pocket of Hindus living somewhere in Sindh or, somewhere near Northwest Frontier Province, that went to Pakistan. So the principle of contiguity was there. So Radcliffe and his team, now the point is that he had one team who was from Indian side and one team who was from the Muslim League, one person from Muslim League. Obviously the two would not agree. So Radcliffe had to adjudicate between the two. And so he then drew it on a detailed map, both on the western side as well as the eastern side. And I think very wisely, they released this map only 2 days after Independence Day. So on 15th August, when he raised the flag, people near the border were not sure where they were. But anyway, this map was released. So marking a boundary on a map is called delineation. So now it is marked on the map. So it was signed by the Indian side and also signed by the three of them and given. And it so happened that both India and Pakistan accepted it. In case we had not accepted it, there would have been disputes. Though subsequently in 1965, there was a dispute in Kutch. And we still have a dispute in between Kutch and Sindh that is called the Sir Creek. So minor disputes are there, but this is accepted on both sides. Now after that, all the government departments were partitioned. 1/3 went to Pakistan. So they had the nucleus of a survey of Pakistan. So then the surveyors on both sides got together, agreed on the map. Then they have to go on the ground and camp over there in tents or whatever, or dark bungalow, whatever is available, and agree to marking on the ground. And then wherever the border turns, at that turning point, they put a boundary pillar, which is a stone pillar, and probably marked BP, and they give a number to that, BP, 275, 276. And those boundary pillars are marked on the map, agreed between both the parties. And this is how boundaries are marked between two farms, for instance. So you put a boundary pillar.
I was thinking of just that. I mean, when you have to buy a new plot of land, somebody will put those 4 granite pillars in the corners.
So exactly the same process, but a little more elaborate and bigger boundary pillars. And the boundary pillars will have inscribed on it the number on it. And so then, as it is, you had 2 master maps. Now these are transferred to the master maps, exchanged, and then ratified by the respective governments. So that becomes a demarcation.
I can also imagine if we just look up political map of India, just the size of that line on the map, if you actually translate it to the territory, might be several kilometers wide. The line that is drawn on the map, that demarcation of the exact spot becomes extremely important. And you said it also has to be agreed on both sides that this is the right spot.
Yeah, that's why you go to a detailed map. By way of perspective, what is used in aviation generally is called a million map. That is 1 centimeter on the map is a million centimeters on the ground. So that translates to 1 millimeter on the map becoming 1 kilometer on the ground. So now, if you draw a pencil line, it can easily be 0.5 millimeter, 1 millimeter in width. But what happens is, if you go to more detailed map, let's say 1:250,000, where 1 centimeter is equal to 250,000 centimeters on the ground, then that map is 4 times more accurate in length and 4 times more accurate in width. That means now it has 16 times more detail in it. That map is used by, let's say, in the army, it's used by the artillery and all that. Then you have more detailed maps. In the old days, it was 1 inch to 1 mile. The metric equivalent is 1:50,000. So 1 centimeter in the map is 50,000 centimeters on the ground. Even you have more detailed. So in your Google Maps, for instance, as you zoom in, there is a scale in the bottom right. And scale is fundamental to a map. You have to understand scale, what we are talking about. And if you want to measure the distance from A to B, you have to, in the old days when I was in school, you had to take a divider or something, see the scale and put it there. Today, Google does it on a computer and gives you the road distance, it'll give you the air distance, it'll give you all sorts of distances. So our life has become easier that way. So you have the 3 stages: definition of a boundary, which can be verbal or written by features, or, very often a boundary follows a river, for instance, or it follows a mountain range, and the sea is a very obvious boundary. So that is by description. Then the second stage is delineation, where you mark it on a map and both sides agree. And the third final stage is demarcation, where you mark it on the ground.
That is the point at which I want to come to India and China. Do we have A, B, or C?
See, with our neighbors, we have demarcated the border with Pakistan, with Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Burma, Myanmar. The border which is not demarcated is the border between India and China. And that is where the problem comes.
So no part of the longest border between India and China is demarcated anywhere on the ground.
That is correct. We have not demarcated it. And that has been my theme for the last 25, 30 years, that we should sit down and demarcate the border. Of course, there are many views on that. Some people say that we are ready, the other side is not ready, and the other side may say something else. So the border is not demarcated.
Then the previous step. Are parts of the border delineated, where we have put the line on the map, we have exchanged the maps, and we agree that the line is there? Has that happened?
That has not happened to a final conclusion, but there have been talks and talks about delineation, and everybody's heard of the famous McMahon line. McMahon was the Foreign Secretary of India, and he convened the conference in Shimla 1913, 1914. So they did come out with a map, and that is only of the eastern border, starting with the tri-junction of Bhutan, India and Tibet, going up to Myanmar. That time Myanmar was part of India. So there you have a map which has been exchanged, but that is a big story by itself. I won't go too much into it. Now, similarly, the border between Sikkim and Tibet, again, there is not much controversy. It follows the crest line of the mountains. Then Uttarakhand and Himachal with Tibet also, there is more or less an agreed border, but that is not demarcated. But by and large, there have been some minor disputes, but in general, it's been accepted. The 2 areas where we had actual fighting in 1962 were in Ladakh and in Arunachal Pradesh. Tawang area north of that Dola Post, Namkachu and all that. And not disputed, but as a fallout of the war in the northeast, in Walong, there was an incursion by the Chinese. But the dispute was in the Namkachu area. So the disputed border can be divided into 2. The major dispute, the northeast or the eastern border, which is the McMahon line and things like that, and the Ladakh border. So these, from our side, we claim that it's been fully settled. The McMahon line is based on the Shimla conference and fallout of that. Right now, the flare-up is in the Galwan Valley, that is in Ladakh. And the history of the Ladakh border goes back to the 10th century, where in the year approximately 930 AD, a king of that area divided his kingdom among three sons. One son was given Lahore, one was given Ladakh, and the other was given the Western Tibet, the Rudak area and right up to the Kailash and all that. But it was defined as the boundary will be from Demchok, it'll go this area, it'll go that area, divide the Pangong So Lake, and it'll go up to Lanakla. But that line stopped at Aksai Chin. Aksai Chin was not part of this. This line was reaffirmed in a treaty somewhere around 1684. Then you had the Dogra campaign in Ladakh, Zorawar Singh and all that. And in 1842, there was a battle at Chushul where the Dogra side defeated the Tibetans and they had a peace agreement. This is the famous agreement of 1842 because that is the latest written agreement. But the contents of that agreement or that it reaffirmed the traditional boundary which dated back 900 years before that. So it was a verbal understood boundary but well understood. And I would say that our claim from Demchok to Aksai Chin is very solid, though the Chinese have encroached beyond that. Then Aksai Chin is a little different because Aksai Chin has not been settled. It was not part of the 1842 agreement and it was a claim line by us. But the Chinese had not answered and not replied to that claim. The Chinese point of view is that it was no man's land and they occupied it first. So our claim is that it was a thinly held area and that is ours.
Where people would go from the Ladakh area to...
Yeah, hunters and travelers. It was not a settled area. Okay, now, there's been a lot of history. We had the 62 war and all that. We now have what we call the LAC, the line of actual control, which is the line held by the troops on both sides. And it is fairly well known, but there have been disputes. There was a dispute in Nathula, Jelapla in 1967. There's been dispute in Sumdarong, Doklam. And the pattern in many of these is that the Chinese have advanced and then claim that as the line of actual control. Then there's a disengagement and maybe they advance 5 kilometers. As part of the disengagement, they withdraw 2 kilometers, which leaves them 3 kilometers, forward.
So this is the 2 steps forward, 1 step backward line, which we've seen now being used in many places.
So the Galwan dispute of 1962 happened near the source of the Galwan River. Now it is almost, I would say, about 50 kilometers to the west. It's almost where it reaches the Shyok River. So definitely the mood in India now is that enough is enough. We're not going to tolerate any more of this. And we're now dug in our heels. And what will happen after this? Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens. But the mood in India has definitely changed.
So, Joseph, since on the Indian side, you and your colleagues were doing these aerial surveys, including of the border areas from, say, the late 60s, what about similar efforts from the Chinese side? When did they start?
First thing I'd like to say is that a good 10 years before I joined, my seniors had been doing the aerial survey and updating the map. So it's not from the late 60s, it's from the late 50s that we started the aerial survey and updating all the old maps and all that. So I was only one cog in the wheel. The Chinese, if you see the report of the officials of the border meeting in 1960, they admitted that they did not have proper maps of the area. They admitted that the map they have of the area is of scale 1:5 million, which is really like a school atlas, nothing more than that. So they really did not even know what they were talking about in 1960 and all that. Though, of course, they had a copy of the McMahon line. That is in the eastern side. But the northern sector, they had no maps worth talking about. Now, 1950 was the first time in 5,000 years of history that they were physically in occupation of Tibet. Otherwise, you could say they were big brother, they had some sort of suzerainty over Tibet, but they were not really ruling Tibet. And they might have had knowledge of the border areas between China and Tibet, but they had very little knowledge about the border areas between Tibet and India. In fact, you might be interested to know that for the Simla conference of 1913-14, the standard route to travel between Peking and Lhasa was to come by sea to Calcutta and go overland to Nathula or Jalapla and then go from the Chumbi Valley up to Lhasa. So they had to go through India to go to Tibet. So that was the condition at that time. So things were quite different. But whatever the rights or wrongs in 1949-50, they invaded Tibet. So that's part of history. So as of 62, they had the McMahon Line, which is not an accurate map, is made in 1913. The Ladakh area, they didn't have proper maps. And that is why, if you see the history of the thing, each year their claim line was changing. But obviously, they are a country that has modernized over the years, just like India. So what they did in the 50s and 60s would be ground survey. For the first time, in 1980, they put a request through diplomatic channels saying that their IL-18, which is a turboprop aircraft and which cannot fly as high as the Canberra, they wanted to use that for aerial survey of the border between Tibet and India. Of course, they call it the China-India border. And they wanted our permission to let them fly on the border because, the border goes a little zigzag and an aeroplane flying at high speed cannot follow those zigzags. It has to...
So they'll enter our airspace.
Yeah, so they said if our aeroplane does a minor accidental incursion, please excuse that. So which was very reasonable and quite okay from their part. So we accepted that, but in return we said that we also want to survey our border, and so please permit our aircraft to fly along the border and please excuse any minor accidental incursion at the border. And we used that opportunity to once more revise the maps, because maps have to be revised in a period of time because villages develop into towns. Dams are built, lakes are made, roads are made, railway lines are made. So the maps require periodic updating, which in the old days was done by physically going on the ground, during our time by photographing the area. And today you have, of course, satellites and GPS and all that.
So in that sense, during this perhaps 60s to 80s period, India had an advantage over China when it came to mapping the border region.
Oh yes, we were 20 years ahead of them.
So when we talk about the US-Russia bomber gap and other things which are funny, but it's amazing to learn that there was an era where we were technologically far more advanced with our aerial mapping and our systems than China.
Oh yes, there's history behind it. The Chinese were at war for 25, 30 years before. They had a civil war. They had a war with Japan before the Second World War, and it was triangular war. So they suffered quite a lot. And the only reason the Europeans did not colonize China, conquer China, because they could not agree on how to divide China among themselves. So China's had a different history from us, but they've also been quite backward. And their real progress in science, technology and all that has happened in the last 40 years.
Since Deng Xiaoping and others. And perhaps once the satellite era and satellite imaging came about, there was more parity between both our sides, and since the 80s as well.
Yeah, satellites came later, and the early satellites were not good at photography. Digital photography has really, I would say, come of age in the last about 20 years. And there also you see the difference in the resolution. The early satellites didn't have so much of resolution. Now, of course, they are better. But even now, when you want some very detailed mapping of a city, or you want to plan a new township or things like that, then certain amount of aerial photography has to be done, but much less than before.
And now, of course, aerial photography includes drones. So we are in a new area there as well.
Yeah, drones are a complete new field in aviation.
To now that there is a border, therefore, in practice, right? So there's a line of actual control that is sort of one firmly held by Indian troops and posts and so on, one that is firmly held by the Chinese troops and posts. There is a buffer in between of some sort in many places, right? I mean, will there be a no man's land, or is it places where people go patrol but there is no permanent post? Is that where some of the conflict can happen and is happening?
Yes, the agreement is that in this buffer zone, each side can patrol, but they're supposed to patrol unarmed. And this is how we've had a so-called unarmed conflict in Galwan, where the reports are that one side used clubs and things like that. And so I don't want to go into what is happening today because the situation is changing from day to day. And we are now discussing the background to it, what is happening now and what will happen tomorrow. We need to understand the background, but I don't want to get into that because there are a lot of people engaged in that. And you and I are not aware of the full details of what is exactly happening on the ground over there.
So one of the frequent things that I've heard being used is that when people talk about the India-China border, they talk about the principle of the watershed. That you have this highest watershed, this top peak of mountains where water flows in one direction on one side, south towards the Indian side, north perhaps towards the Chinese side. And then if that principle can be used to sort of mark the border, that can be something that is useful. Does that apply in the places where there is a conflict? First of all, is this watershed idea true everywhere? And then I'll ask about Ladakh specifically.
Yeah, okay. I'll start with the eastern side and go on to the west. In the eastern side, the de facto border we are holding on the ground and the McMahon line, it's more or less along the watershed. But the thing about that sector is that there are areas where streams and rivers cut the mountain ridge. For instance, the Brahmaputra originates in Tibet and it flows through Arunachal Pradesh into Assam. So that area, obviously, if you want to take the watershed, then even Lhasa will come within the watershed. And similarly, where we fought the 62 war, that Namkachu area, there is a stream, maybe you can even call it a small river, which flows in from Tibet and cuts that line. So I prefer the term crest line rather than the strict watershed. So the border in Arunachal Pradesh follows the crest line, and that is how the surveyors in 1913-14 intended to draw it. But when better maps are available, there may be some minor adjustments required in that. Okay, so as you go westwards, you have the Sikkim-Tibet border, which also follows the crest line. But in Sikkim, there is a wedge called the Chumbi Valley, which juts into between Sikkim and Bhutan. It forms a V-shaped wedge. But that also, there is not much of dispute. There is a crest line. Then you have Nepal, and then Uttarakhand, Himachal, there also it follows the crest line. Now, for instance, the Sutlej River originates in Tibet and then cuts through the Himalayan range and flows into India. So that's one place where you can't strictly follow the watershed. If you want to follow the watershed, it goes into Tibet. We are not claiming that. So I prefer to call this the crest line. But when you go from northwards from Himachal into Ladakh and then that border, that is not a crest line nor a watershed because the Indus River flows west. You're now going across the mountain ranges. You're not following the mountain ranges. So I would say from Himachal all the way to Arunachal, the border more or less follows the Himalayan range. But in the Ladakh sector, that is not so. You're going across. There's the Indus River. You're going across the Indus River. Then there are minor streams, tributaries and all that. And Aksai Chin is a very complicated area. It's a plateau area. Part of it is internal drainage and some streams flow westwards into India, Shyok River, which itself is a tributary of the Indus. And there are a few streams which flow north into Sinkiang.
And internal drainage meaning it's like a little bowl over there where it doesn't drain into any sea or any area, but into itself.
Yeah, there are many areas all over the world which are internal. Dead Sea or the Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea, they're all internal drainage. We have internal drainage in Rajasthan also. Some of the rivers just flow there and the water soaks into the ground, evaporates. A lot of Tibet has internal drainage. So, and I won't use the term bowl for Aksai Chin. It is quite flat. I would rather say it's more like a saucer than a bowl. It's very flat. The gradient is slow. It does have some internal drainage and some lakes. The Galwan River is a river, it's a tributary of the Shyok. Northwards near Daulat Begoldi, you have the Chipchap River. And the Chipchap River is parallel to the Galwan River. But as it turns south, it becomes the Shyok River. The name changes. It's like the Sangpo. The Sangpo becomes the Dehang becomes the Brahmaputra. All three are the same river. So the Chipchap becomes the Shyok. That is the area. So definitely the Chinese have violated the agreements. In 1993, after negotiations at the officer level, staff level, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao visited China. And in September 1993, he signed a landmark agreement to maintain peace and tranquility on the border. The underlying idea was that we would maintain peace and tranquility on the border. And eventually, in course of time, in future generations, the line of actual control would become an international border, maybe with some minor adjustments to suit the terrain, which would be a technical matter, not a political matter. But unfortunately, between 93 and now, we have not really made any progress. It still remains a line of actual control. Well, now it is 57, 58 years since the 62 war. We've had only two really violent incidents. One was in Nathula in 1967 and one is now in Galwan. But other than that, we've not had a full-scale conflict, which is one of the plus points.
But now that it's happening in 2020, we have no idea what the future might be like.
How this will play out. But talking long term, talking 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now, maybe the next generation, we need to settle the border. Agreed settlement between two neighbors. And you need to delineate the border and you need to demarcate it. As they say, good fences make good neighbors. So we need to have a good demarcated border. If that will happen in our children's time or grandchildren's time, we can't say.
Joseph, thank you so much for joining me on BIC Talks and giving us so much perspective and so much history to an ongoing conflict that is still shrouded in fog, that is shrouded in a lot of difficulty, a lot of conflict. Thank you for really educating us.
Thank you, Pavan.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week. And do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.